sure. Okay. And I'll share my screen. Here we go. Okay. All right. Good morning. And we're starting a minute earlier. And after we go over the general introduction, I'm gonna hand you all, turn you in from panelists, from attendees to panelists, so we could be able to see all each other and start the webinar today. So first of all, good morning, and thanks for joining us today for our webinar. Some of you know my name is Carmen Boone. I'm an education coordinator from Oregon Pacific Area Health Education Center, a hosted agency of Samaritan Lebanon Community Hospital. Our agency mission is to promote access to quality healthcare through community and educational partnership. Today, I'll be your host and moderator. Some housekeeping items for today. Please mute your microphones and unmute them to answer questions. Use the Q&A for questions and chat for comments or answers at any time. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on our YouTube channel. If you have any question, please email me at the email address you see on the screen right now. It's carmenb@somehealth.org. To obtain CME or continuing education credit or credit units, you must log into www.eeds.com and enter this activity code. Please write it down for your records and keep in mind that it expires in 1 week. We will email you these instructions and links tomorrow, okay? Another thing to note is that via EADS, you can download the slides for today. This presentation is jointly provided by Samaritan Health Services, Oregon AHEC, Oregon Health and Science University, and Oregon Pacific AHEC. The presenters and planners of this activity report that we have no conflicts of interest or relevant financial relationships with any commercial entities that might affect the contents of this presentation. And this presentation is presented by Dr. Tina Runyan. And today we won't have Dr. Joan Fleishman, but they both are clinical psychologists with backgrounds in academic medicine and integrated behavioral health. Through their work as directors of behavioral health programs in family medicine residencies, they identified a need for better mental health and well-being support for clinicians. In 2020, they founded 10 Health to focus on providing specialized and accessible mental health care to healthcare professionals. 10 Health offers mental health care in 9 states, including Oregon and Washington. They are passionate about clinician well-being and consult with healthcare organizations to improve well-being and reduce barriers to care. Now, without further ado, I'll leave you with Dr. Tina Runyan.
Thank you, Carmen. Good morning. I was just reflecting on that last slide you showed of her particular stretch. That's the stretch that my physical therapist has given me. So I was like, oh, I need to do that today. that stretch of that hip muscle. Anyway, good morning, everyone. Nice to be with you on this early morning in Oregon. I am joining you from outside of Boston, Massachusetts. So it is a little bit more of a manageable time in the morning for me, but I'm really pleased to be here with all of you. Hopefully some of you have been to our practice labs before. For some of you, it might be the first time. This is intended to be a little bit of a different experience than the typical lecture format. So we did do a lecture format 2 weeks ago related to a lot of the content. I will do a little brief reminder of some of that content, and then really would like to engage with you all in a more experiential way to bring some of these concepts out of our knowing and into our knowing, sort of to be able to metabolize these concepts through practice. So that's my hope today. And would, when we get to that point, would love if anyone is open and willing for taking their, putting their camera on or engaging in that way. Would be lovely to see if you're willing. And I really, really do want to invite the dialogue today, and we'll have some opportunity for practice. So I am Tina Runyan, and I'm a mindfulness teacher at the Center for Mindfulness at University of Massachusetts Medical School, where I teach mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, which is an 8-week program, very similar to mindfulness-based stress reduction, that really is focused on using these concepts in the application of anxiety and depression primarily. So it's a kind of a clinical intervention. So that's where I'm coming from my mindfulness platform and background. So we have been doing a series for now, I guess, the last 8 weeks, and we'll continue for 4 more weeks, or through June, actually 2 more months. And each of these presentations, or each of these topics, have a presentation component to them and a practice lab component. So we're in the practice lab component of this series of mindfulness and clinical practice. And in a couple weeks, we'll do a focus on compassionate leadership, which I think is very timely relative to this protracted time of the pandemic, and as we move into next phase of what does reintegration look like. And then we'll round out with some very intentional work on mindful communication and managing difficult conversations, which can be in work, but also in life. Difficult conversations are not, for better or worse, they're not confined to our work setting. So that's what's on the horizon. And as Carmen mentioned, we at Tend Health are very passionate and dedicated to providing well-being services, and are on a mission to destigmatize mental health in healthcare settings. We do provide services to individuals and organizations, but that work does not in any way impact the content of the presentation today. We are not selling anything to you other than ideas and experience. So the ground rules for the practice lab: if you can have your camera on, that's great. It's just as I get through some additional slides, we'll be able to be more in community through this Zoom format and call a little bit of a group. You can change your name if you want. You can include anything on your name square. If you click on where you see your name in your little square, it should pop up a rename option, as long as you're not on an iPad or your phone, and you can put your full name or just your first name. If you want to put anything in terms of your clinic site or where you're located, you can do that. When you do share, it's really helpful if you just state your name and maybe a little bit of your role or the organization you work with, just so I can have some context as the rest of the group can. And a reminder not to share any, if you're asking questions, not to share any protected health information. And I do ask that, that we all participate in a way that actually elevates the whole community in terms of learning. So I'm presenting, but I learned so much through the experience of sharing, and know that if you have a question, it is likely that other people have those questions as well. So you're really contributing not only to furthering your own knowledge, but really helping everybody gain in that way. So there is a post-session survey, and I know that Carmen and we really appreciate you completing that because it helps us to be better. So a little reminder to start, just a definition of mindfulness. When we talk about mindfulness, there is a word cloud of associations that come to mind now with this term mindfulness, because it's so popular in our vernacular and in the space of self-care and wellness and everything, you know, magazines, popular magazines, you see it all over the place. And sometimes that term gets conflated with a lot of things that it may not be. So when I'm talking about mindfulness, I'm really talking about awareness that emerges because we are paying attention to things just as they are. And I like to insert the term with compassion, paying attention to things as they are with compassion rather than non-judgmentally. Because one of the things we can pay attention to is that we're not paying attention. And oftentimes when we notice we are not paying attention, the first thing that swoops in is self-judgment. Oh, I'm supposed to be paying attention. I didn't pay attention. What did she just say? And the first thing that swoops in often for many of us is that self-critical inner critic, and we can start judging ourselves. So I like to think about mindfulness as really the moment you're aware of where your attention is, even if it's not where you intended it to be, is a moment of mindfulness, because you are aware of where your attention is. And that, to be deeply compassionate and even grateful about that moment of awareness of not paying attention, so that you can meet that with kindness and pick up and move your attention to the place where you actually do intend it to be. And I have found that that approach to mindfulness actually has supported my ability to intentionally pay attention, because I don't get sucked in to that spiral of self-judgment about what I wasn't paying attention to. When I meet it, even try to meet it non-judgmentally, for me, I often just find that there's a lot of judgment there. So this is how I like to think about mindfulness, is paying attention on purpose with compassion to things exactly as they are. And the awareness that arises from doing that is the awareness that is filtering in all the time through our senses. Our senses are always taking in so much information from the environment around us. And we are constantly making sense of it at multiple different levels. We're making sense of it a lot in our head, which is a little slower to make sense of our sensory input. And we're making sense of it a lot in our bodies, which is much quicker to make sense of it. And without this wedge of awareness that mindfulness can bring, we are much more likely to be reactive to the stimuli that's coming in, rather than being intentionally responsive to the stimuli. When we can have this wedge of awareness, this wedge of mindfulness, where we can actually pause in some small way, it may be a millisecond, to not be just jerked around by this process of reacting to all the stimuli that are coming in. It actually is an invitation to step out of automatic pilot in many ways, which we can talk about. So when I talk about mindfulness, and I talk about it not being something you do 10 minutes a day, it really starts with this concept of noticing. And we can notice in many different ways. And often we can notice best when we drop out of the interpretation of what we're noticing. So just an invitation actually right now, and people could unmute themselves or chat in. What are you noticing right now? What do you notice? I'm noticing that every time I stop talking, I hear birdsong outside of my windows. What are you noticing? Anyone?
I'm noticing the sound of the fan of my computer.
Yeah. Dog feet on the floor is little, sounds like maybe the nails. Yeah. The hum of my laptop. Sound of the AC. Oh, it's lovely that you are in a place where AC is on, actually. Reminder that spring and summer are coming. Yeah, these noises. What else? Feeling a cool breeze from the window. Yeah. I have an old school clock next to me, and I notice the ticking of the second hand. That's your kitty, your dog. Yeah, so a lot of sounds.
We have Christine that's telling us a cool breeze from the window. Michelina, her dog breathing. Jessie is sharing with us that her kitty's telling her she's hungry.
Yeah. What is anybody noticing underneath the skin? Is anyone noticing anything inside yourself?
I'm starting to pay attention to how tight my chest is.
Uh-huh. Yeah. The morning, right, is unfolding. And yeah, so just starting to feel some tension inside your chest. Michelina says a warm heart.
Cindy's telling us that she feels like she has a lot to do today and it's making her a little anxious.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's even just this beautiful description of how quickly our thoughts can activate something inside of our bodies. That even though right now you have protected this time and carved this time to be here in this space, the mind is happy to go into the future and to create some activity inside. Oh, sore from working in the garden. Yeah. Several gardeners and landscapers here. Good, lots of noticing here. Lots of noticing also of that connection, that mind-body connection. This is beautiful, which can work both ways. When we really start to pay attention, we can see how things in our mind can generate responses in our bodies, and how things in our bodies can create things in our mind. So this idea, like Jessie, of soreness from working in the garden, or Vel, soreness in the body from working in the yard. This soreness has some known cause, if you will, and may then allow you to interpret it quite differently than, right, soreness in the low back, for example, or other kinds of soreness, because you have that feedback from the body, but you're not allowing it to generate a whole story necessarily, because you sort of know the source of it and where it's coming from. Green tea warming my body. Lovely. I love all the noticing. How does that noticing serve us, do you think? How can all that noticing be helpful in the work that we do? Any thoughts about that? Oops. Yeah, lovely. Awareness. It brings us into the moment. Yep. Time to respond and not react to our bodies and our surroundings. Yeah. Lovely. Yeah, course correct. It's that wedge of awareness. Once you start noticing, you have an opportunity that may not otherwise be there. Yeah. So often in the work that we do, we learn how, either by modeling or through other ways, that actually separating from our body, detaching from our body, pushing away our internal experience is not only what is necessary, but we start to feel like it's helpful, like that we need to do that in order to keep doing what we're doing. And just in this little micro moment, it actually can see how there might be some real wisdom to pause and notice what's happening inside, because it can allow you to course correct. It can allow you to zoom out and be able to see things in a greater context than you might otherwise be able to if you're not mindful of what's happening inside you, if you're pushing that away. But we often learn to do that. We learn to ignore our internal experience in service to what's outside of us. And this practice of mindfulness, this way of being, if you will, of paying attention, can actually, and ideally does, include this much broader context of both what's outside of us and what's inside of us. And sometimes what's inside of us can be incredibly rich cues to help us navigate what's outside of us, that we don't actually have to ignore it. And there may be some real risks of ignoring. What do you think? And again, we can keep chatting, or I'm open to people unmuting and sharing as well. What might be the risk of not noticing what's happening inside you in your work or in your life? What's the risk?
Well, after thinking about this and what you're saying, when those little dog feet run across the floor, I panic and I look for, oh my God, am I on mute? I don't want to ruin everything. But then, so I did that earlier, and I had to get off and come back in to make sure that you weren't hearing this. And then when I finally stopped, my heart is racing, and I have AFib, so I need to be careful. But I don't think about that. I'm in the reaction mode and the panic mode. So how can you really concentrate and enjoy your work when you've got all these, I'm reacting too much. I just need to chillax. And now that you've got me thinking about that, I'm thinking about what's going on in my body.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. It's when we are activated in that way, so well said. When we're activated in that way, our thinking brain really does go offline in some ways, right? We can't really focus. We can't really learn. I was just, meeting with a client this morning who was talking about being in a training environment and getting some feedback that was pretty critical, and all the other instruction after you did this wrong, you did that wrong, all the other guidance for how to improve was completely lost on him. He couldn't even articulate what that was, because he was so activated and fearful after sort of being criticized in a pretty harsh way, which can happen in medicine, a very direct and harsh way. And so the instruction, the teaching points never even got in because he was so activated. and wasn't able at that moment, for all kinds of reasons, including sort of medicine and hierarchy and all those things, to be able to bring himself down, to notice that's what's happening, to bring himself down, or to pause and ask for a moment to be able to do that so that he could benefit from the actual instruction. But very similar to what you're saying, as soon as we are, spinning and not aware of it, we're just in reactive mode. Yeah. Missing what's going on around you and inside of you. When we stop noticing, we can just go into autopilot, right? And just sort of do what our bodies and our training know how to do. Does anybody else want to say anything about that? Of what are the risks of not noticing?
I think the other gal who was talking about her AFib and anxiety really touched upon it. I think if we ignore what's happening inside, it can certainly lead to devastating physical issues, not just mental, but physical. Obviously, they're connected, but and we need to help our patients do the same and do course correct with, as you said, mindfulness, acupuncture, and other things.
Yeah, that it's that parallel process, right? Where, for people, helping our patients and people we see get more in tune and in touch with what's happening underneath the skin, to be able to meet that with compassion and with responsiveness, and how doing that ourselves, we're really at risk of pushing through oftentimes and ignoring what messages are coming through our body. I certainly have been very much at risk of that at times in my life, where there's clearly some messages being tossed at me from my body. And I just sort of like, we'll just push through that. We'll just push through that. I can promise you that has never ended well. Great. Don't follow the small clues. And it often is easier, less intensive to correct when we are deeply tuned into those small cues than when we ignore, and then it becomes something much bigger and much more difficult to course correct and much more, time consuming to correct. Yeah. Jesse, leading to chronic illness. Both physical and mental because of that connection. So there are some real risks of not noticing. What gets in the way of noticing? Because all of you are clearly on board, like, yes, I know how to notice. You just told me all the things you were noticing. I know how to notice. I can tell you why it's important to notice, but we don't always do it. We're not always mindful in our lives and in ourselves. So what gets in the way? Stress, the need to be busy, distractions. I invite any of you, if you're willing, I'd love to hear your voice in this space. So would anyone willing to unpack any of these anymore? I'm very, very interested, Cindy. I don't know if you're willing to come on. The way you phrased your comment, I think, is, is so, it's so cultural. The need to be busy. I don't know if you're willing to say any more about that.
No, it just seems like it's a syndrome that our culture has. The need to be busy so we don't have to pay attention or have to notice. Yeah, so that if we stay busy enough, keep the distractions alive,
we actually don't have to turn in and sort of sit with and be with what is here. That is often what, yeah, go ahead.
I think it scares people, like the emotions, the feelings, the thoughts can be scary for some people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to Michelina's point, what we often see once we get quiet, and why people will often say, you know, I can't meditate, or I hate meditating. To Michelina's point, is that's often what we see. As soon as we sort of quiet the noise, the outside noise, and we go in, most of us see a lot of judgment, a lot of that inner critic kind of comes on stage. And so that can actually be a big barrier to keep us from noticing. Yeah. Yeah. Michelina, you also said stress keeps us from noticing. I'm wondering if you're willing to say any more about that. Oftentimes stress, even though it's generating a lot of feedback inside of us, that feeling of stress can often keep us moving in a direction, or feeling like we don't have time to pause. We don't have, we're not able to look, kind of notice inside. We're not willing to do that. It's just going to be more stress to be able to do that, something else to attend to. So this idea that that stress, which often produces a lot of things to notice in us, also becomes the thing that is a barrier to doing that. And all of these things really are in the space of mindfulness, because until we can or are willing to name them and see them, there's not much we can really do about them. And sometimes it really just starts at that place. It really just starts with the noticing, and to notice the things that make noticing so hard. And I really appreciate the engagement on this and the chat on this, to see how human the barriers to noticing are. Yeah, I get really fixated on something. Stress has a way of creating some cognitive rigidity, some putting up guardrails even tighter for us. We get really can get really hyper-focused. And so then we're not really paying attention, both more broadly outside as well as inside. Yeah, commitments we make to others. Oh, in healthcare, right? This is a big one, though. Yes. And I raise my hand to this one, even as a mindfulness teacher, that, you know, commitments to others, and how do you create some intentional time for self? And this is why I like to think also about mindfulness as something we can bring into our workday. It doesn't have to be something we do outside of it, or we do 10 minutes a day with an app. Or that we have to always do it in a formal way. There are plenty of days where I have a formal mindfulness meditation practice, and there's plenty of days where I don't have a formal practice, and am much more intentional on those days to bring it into my life in an informal way, which is really about this noticing and really paying attention to create some intentional pause to say, like, how is it now? And how can I best serve what I'm doing outside of me, and how can I best serve myself in this moment, knowing that there are limitations and constraints. So I'd like you to consider a recent challenging interaction maybe that you had at work, ideally, although it could be at home if all your work interactions are just going swimmingly. And to think about these questions. So first call to mind a challenging interaction, maybe one that had a little bit of, potentially had some conflict in it. And ask, how well did you listen in that interaction? How well did you really listen? With mindfulness as this present moment awareness, we can bring mindfulness into any interaction, but certainly it can be really useful in challenging interactions where we start to notice a little bit of tension in ourselves. And the invitation in this space, and we'll dig into this a little more in the last session that we have in this series, is, were you really listening or just waiting to talk? Can you appreciate what I mean by that difference? How often are we listening to somebody, but so quickly formulating our response in our heads versus really listening? Because if we're responding already, that has taken us away a little bit. This is a wonderful mindfulness exercise you can do multiple times a day. And to meet it with compassion, so that if you're in an interaction and you're really trying to mindfully listen, and you notice that you're already formulating a response, instead of meeting that with, oh, I'm supposed to be listening, oh, such an idiot, I'm supposed to be listening, you recognize that each time you do it, you can, in a microsecond, you can bring yourself back, drop into listening. And to really congratulate yourself each time you notice that, because you're noticing probably in a way that was very different from even before this prompt. And to see if you can be in that space of really deeply listening, not just waiting to talk. Yeah, Christine is saying that you can relate to that. You're just sometimes just such in a rush. Yeah. So this mindfulness practice is so portable, and so much of what we can bring to our clinical practice that isn't about meditation, right? So it's really mindfully listening. And so when you're listening also in this, communication, or just in anything that you're doing, how much are we aware of what's happening underneath the skin? What's happening in our own thoughts? What's happening in our emotions? What's happening in our body? And how that is such a rich source of data to help inform what's happening in this conversation. And then being able to think about mindfully ending the interaction and transitioning. So this is another mindfulness practice we can bring into our work, which is mindfully ending an interaction and transitioning. So often we can carry the residue, particularly from challenging interactions, into our next part of our day or our next interaction. That our body physically has transitioned to this next encounter, but there's so much residue happening inside that it really makes it hard to be present moment aware in this next interaction. So I'm wondering if anyone has any reflections about this or thoughts about this as a mindfulness practice that really can be used in your clinical work.
Well, as you were talking, this is Leah, I was just thinking about the challenging interactions, like being in a meeting with some colleagues and then somebody who often will shut down other people's ideas doing that. And I was thinking about how well did you listen? And I just couldn't find the graciousness in my heart to be like, well, I should listen to them because I feel like I'm not being listened to by that person. So how do you deal with that feeling of you want that reciprocal respect, and if you're not getting it, should you still try to really listen?
Oh, it's a beautiful question, Leah. Yeah. Yeah, that how often, like that we want to extend that, but noticing, I mean, this is beautiful noticing that you're that you're sharing, which is mindfulness. Because you're noticing the reluctance, right? The reticence to offer somebody that when they didn't do it in return, and that you're just naming that so vulnerably and so beautifully that, you know, well, it might be conditional. There might be conditions on this listening thing that you know, that I will do for you if you do for me. And I'm curious, if you can even reflect back on this, what might that have been like inside your body to not want to listen to that person or feel like they don't deserve to be listened to?
I think just the posture. I mean, my video wasn't on, so I was like rolling my eyes.
Yeah. That's great. That's great awareness too, of knowing those body sensations. Yeah. And how well did things go from a stance of not wanting to listen in terms of the interaction resolving or ending?
I think it's just continued resentment, you know, it just carries on into the next time you interact with that person.
Yeah. So lots of great noticing there. I am really appreciative of that, because you can see how that residue will just sort of, and it does for a lot of these, so challenging interactions can become challenging relationships. And you can see how that residue carries over, and may also carry over right to your next encounter with somebody else, because you're kind of a little activated. Or continues to affect you, like this noticing around what's happening inside your own body and feeling a little bit tense or irritated or frustrated, not only means the interaction didn't go quite as well, but that residue lives inside you. And so we'll talk in a moment about just a couple of strategies to just sort of move that energy through, because these will happen, and we will be, we are human, and we will be imperfect in our ability to do this, to be able to recognize real time when you're guarded and when you're defended. But what you're naming there is like, oh, I have some conditions around how deeply I want to show up for somebody who's not showing up for me. And then the question I would have is just, is really, how is that serving you? And if it is, it sometimes we need to do that. So I'm not saying that as a general, like sometimes we need to do that and sort of be a little protective if the interaction is potentially harmful in some way. And sometimes we can begin to slowly make a shift and not have our listening and our attention be conditional on someone else. And it doesn't mean that you're agreeing with or affirming or accepting any of the content of what they're saying. You are just committing to staying in a posture of open awareness. And sometimes those can be hard. And sometimes people will say to me, well, if I'm so mindful and accepting of everything as it is, I'm just going to become sort of complacent and complicit and apathetic, or sort of not care about things. And I don't want to conflate those two, that mindfulness often can bring a quality of discernment to both our interactions and to our interactions sort of with life in the world. It's this quality of discernment to be able to be responsive with impact and not just reactive. Reactive is a stance of something we care about deeply, but we begin to interact in a way that turns people away instead of brings them closer. Whereas with discernment, we can be much more responsive in how we engage in those things that we're really passionate about and care about, that moves us in the desired direction. So, so I don't know the details of this particular interaction, but does that help? Does that flesh that out?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, so just kind of reading the chat too, that that maybe there is a nugget of something worthwhile, even if the delivery isn't that person's strong point. Yeah. Yeah, Jesse really sort of this invitation to not allow these things to linger, to be able to do something. I love that, a little say goodbye to the negative thoughts and allow them to move through you. And we're going to talk about just a couple strategies to do that in a minute. Yeah, sometimes words are powerful, right? They're so imprecise, and yet they are really powerful. We can't unhear things. So some parts of the word stay in my brain. And this is really that stance of discernment too, because it works both ways in terms of using mindfulness as a way to be in our work interactions. That in as much as you're saying, Michelina, that sometimes, you know, whether it's somebody's intention or not, the impact on you is that there's something sticky there that you can't unhear. And mindfulness can really help us not be on the other side of that. That when we can be mindful of what's happening within us, instead of reacting and saying something that has a negative impact on someone else, we can stay in that space, kind of, if we can name even to ourselves what's happening, then we're less at risk of saying or doing something that has that same effect on somebody else. And trying to be curious. Yeah. Curiosity is extremely powerful. Sorry. Curiosity is extremely powerful for these kinds of interactions. Like, even if you don't appreciate what somebody is saying, or you don't appreciate that they're not holding space and listening to you, to ask questions and to stay curious. That can actually be physiologically a state for us that is not contracted, that is actually much more expansive and much healthier just physiologically for us. Yeah, so Michelina also saying, I don't know if you're willing to come on. I'd love to hear you say a little bit more about this, picking up cues when you walk into rooms for people. You may just want to stay on chat, that's fine. We communicate so much non-verbally. We communicate, need to find audio. All of us communicate so much non-verbally. Like Leila, you were saying, my video was off so I could roll my eyes. And that may have both felt like a release, but it was also keeping you in a contracted stance of like, I don't want to listen to this person. They didn't extend me that grace. But this is also a moment of mindfulness. When I said last time, we miss more by not seeing than by not knowing. And so when we can see from a state of mindfulness, where we can really be aware of what's here outside and what's here inside at the same time, we can pick up on cues that aren't going to show up in a lab value, right? That aren't even going to show up necessarily in the words that somebody's saying, but will show up in a way that we can really sense into reading the person and reading the room based on those cues. And some of that has been affected through the virtual space, but but is still there. I will in working with patients where I'm, looking at the camera, so they try to feel that I'm looking at them. If I ask a particular question, I will very quickly ask the question looking at them, but be very intentional then about looking at the screen to be able to interpret the nonverbals in their response. Michelina, did you find audio? Is there anything more you want to say about that? So I want to just leave you with a couple of different breathing techniques that can be really helpful for grounding into, kind of moving through things through your day that are not mindfulness sort of packaged in a way, but they can support a mindfulness practice by dropping you into your body and by allowing some of that residue, if you will, to move through, particularly for a lot of us in the healthcare space where we are working very sequentially, through a lot of interactions, that by the end of the day, there can be a tremendous amount of residue that builds up. So how can we use our bodies as an agent of change to our emotions and our thoughts? And we have that capacity within us to be able to come to some kind of coherence in our body that invites our emotions and our thoughts to settle. So one is just this technique of diaphragmatic or belly breathing. And so here's the visual. And I will actually just guide us through a couple of moments of this. Feel free to participate if you're willing and able. And I'm going to put one hand on my chest, and you can't see my belly, but I'm going to put a hand on my belly just because it can be helpful to sense, to actually get a sense. The question I ask is like, how do you know you are breathing? We know we're breathing. But how do you know that your body's breathing? And it's really through this physiology and this motion that we know. So the way belly breathing works is you try to keep your chest relatively stable, so you won't see that hand moving very much. And on my inhale, my belly literally goes out because I'm bringing in all the air into the diaphragm. My exhale, my belly drops. Inhale. And exhale. And if you're doing this with me, which I hope you are, I'm going to invite you to bring your attention to see if you can notice that little space that's at the top of the inhale and that brief space at the bottom of the exhale, so that you're breathing in, not holding your breath so much as just noting that space. Breathing out, just notice that space. And maybe try to just make your exhale just a little bit longer than your inhale. And this belly breathing, once you get the hang of it, you certainly don't need to put a hand on your chest, and you can do it anywhere, anytime. It's very portable. It drops us into our body, and it reminds us that we have agency within our body. that we hold that agency within our body to use our physiology to both come into presence and to calm, actually. It may not always work, and mindfulness is not necessarily, it's not the same as relaxation, but we have that agency to come into our body and to regulate. So I'd love to hear if people did that practice with me. What did you notice?
Well, I like the term drop in, and you're just really present and noticing what's going on in your body. I think it just when, especially if you're focusing at to the top of the inhale and the bottom of the exhale, it kind of prevents you from being distracted.
Yes. Yes. Lovely. Yeah. So when we can think of our attention in some ways as a spotlight, and yeah, we can just say, well, I'm going to put the spotlight just for a moment on a few breaths. And I'm really going to try to notice just what is that like, right? You know, there's this 4 parts of the breath, not just inhale, exhale. And that brief moment of focusing attention is such a gift to our nervous system that is constantly, again, taking in all these things. It's just this momentary gift to say just this one thing. Let's just tune into just this one thing. I see a hand up, but I don't know the name, so just go ahead.
Do you hear me?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, finally! I almost lose you.
Oh, Jolina, great.
I have a heavy accent, so I hope so you can understand me.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I am still behind. I do that exercise all the time because I teach my patients to take a deep breath. So I do at work all the time. So when I am working, and help me to relax, even me, I am teaching the patients, doing by myself, and relax me too. So
Yes.
it's very good.
Yes, lovely. And when we can do that, oftentimes other people will do that too. I worked with, I'm gonna just stop sharing so I can see beautiful faces here. I worked with an oncologist once, a pediatric oncologist, and anytime she would, deliver bad news, her practice was to say, I know you have lots of questions. Let's first just breathe a little bit together. This is a lot. And she would breathe, take a few just in very intentional breaths for the families and very much for herself.
Yep.
Right? To just be in that space so that she could be really open to whatever else was going to unfold. Yeah.
Yeah, I am a respiratory therapist, so I know very bad situations, and that helps. Sometimes the patient is very anxious, cannot to breathe or whatever. I say, relax, take a deep, slow breath, and blah, blah, blah. And they relax and they feel, oh, I feel better. Even I didn't know nothing. So sometimes help a lot.
Yeah. Lovely. We get so, in our culture too, we get so used to doing all of this top down and sort of trying to send the information and the message and the, pay attention or relax, do the top down, that we forget that we actually have this mind body connection that can work bottom up. Yeah, that we can.
Feel like all the body can absorb information from the environment. It's something, I don't know, but it's something like you can pick up clues without doing nothing, just looking around. That happened to me. I go in patient room and I can picking up clues without asking question, nothing. I can see the patient, I don't know. It's amazing. It's like all my body can absorb information so easy. Sometimes it's something. Sometimes they told me it's not good the job I am doing because I feel too much. I see a broken leg, I have pain in my leg, So they say you're in the wrong work. Yeah,
Mhm.
but I like my work, but I don't know. It's something on. Sometimes if you are aware, you can feel and you can see more than what is just outside. I don't know, it's something.
It's beautiful. Yeah, I know we're right at time, but I just want to comment on that, yeah, it's all in our bodies. Like
Yes.
the bodies hold so much. And when I think I said this last time, when we can put an empty cup of attention between ourselves and patient, family, friend, partner, an empty cup of attention, and really be open to just seeing whatever is here. And then, yes, oftentimes because of our neuronic, our neurons and what sometimes are called mirror neurons, but also just our resonance, we actually can begin to make sense of what we're seeing by paying attention to what we're noticing in our own bodies. So that's not uncommon, Michelina. When people are, well, it is uncommon, I would say, but it's not, it's explainable when we're really tuned in that way. So that's that's the instruction here. It's the instruction both for your clinical practice, but also for your own well-being, is to not necessarily think about mindfulness as something you do outside of work, or you have to sit lotus position and meditate. It's just a way of being. It's a way of being with other people, and ultimately it's a way of being with yourself.
Yep, it is.
Yeah, so I know we're at time, Carmen, sorry.
Thank
you all for your engagement and your questions today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Really quick. The activity code is 32 REPO. Okay, I think the one that I wrote in the chat it's not the right one. Sorry about that. Again, it's 32 REPO. And just things to remember, we will email you tomorrow because it's embedded in a program. The email will be sent tomorrow, and it'll have all the links. You'll have the instructions to obtain your certificate. It will have the link to YouTube, the link to it, the code, and my email address. If you have any question, feel free to email me. We would appreciate very much if you claim your certificate, because when you claim your certificate, you'll have the option to fill out a program evaluation, and that helps us a lot for future events. Remember, the activity code expires in 1 week, but if you have any problem, I'm always here to help you. The recordings are on our YouTube channel, and I'll send you the link on the email. And thanks for being here today. We have the following sessions on the screen right now. Next, in 2 weeks, we have compassionate leadership. And again, the activity code, sorry that I'm showing it over and over. And thank you so much to being this early with us. And thanks, Tina, for sharing your time and knowledge. And thanks all of you for your participation. And now you have completed the session and you may disconnect. Have a wonderful day.
Bye, everybody.
you. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.